All right, everyone, we got a very special guest, Kashif Khan. He is the CEO of the DNA company. And today we're going to talk about how to use your unique DNA fingerprints to help you prevent disease, help you deal with some health issues that you're perhaps dealing with now and struggling with now, and how to help us function at our best. And we're going to talk about three specific examples. And these examples are pulled from our members that are some of the more common things that people struggle with. So we're going to talk about cardiovascular disease, how to use our DNA fingerprint to help us prevent that. We're going to talk about hormone health and how to use our DNA fingerprint to help dial in those hormones so that they work for us instead of working against us. And executive function or mental health. We'll talk about how knowing our unique DNA fingerprint can help us deal with those things. But first, welcome, Kashif. Thank you for being
here. It's a pleasure. Great to be here with you.
So I first heard about you guys. It was a presentation. It was probably about 4 or 5 years ago now. I think the company had just started, and I was attending a summit up in the Toronto area. And I heard Dr. Mansoor Muhammad speak and completely blew my mind when we started talking about some of these concepts. And we heard about this stuff a little bit with 23andMe and some of the other genetic testing companies. Started doing some stuff, and there's some kind of offshoots from there, some software companies that would take that raw data. We can talk a little bit about what the difference is there. But first, for my audience, that most people watching this have probably no idea what we're going to talk about today. So can you just provide an intro into what it means to test our DNA, and not from a medical perspective, but more from a kind of a different perspective? So go ahead and
Sure.
start
So
there.
that, like you said, there's been a huge evolution from what people have seen and heard in terms of the 23andMe's of the world, which is, hey, maybe you have an 80% chance of Alzheimer's, or you have an 80% chance of breast cancer, which is, what do I do with that information other than have anxiety and now worry, as opposed to why does it happen? So where genetics has now got to is functional interpretation, the same as the work that you would do, for example, rather than masking a symptom and treating the symptom, managing the symptom, asking the question, why did this person get sick in the first place? What were their environment habits, nutrition habits, lifestyle habits? Those same habits layered on top of either a good or a bad gene equal a different outcome for different people. So where we're at now is, by understanding your genome at a functional level, you can understand what choices to make to have that longevity, what we call health span, high quality years in the last parts of your life, avoid chronic disease, slow aging down, have great performance today, better sleep, all the things that we deal with every day, sort of at a macro level. It's now possible to improve those things.
So how are we doing that? Or what are we doing in order to test our genes? Is it a blood test? Is it how's that done?
Yeah, it's a saliva sample. So you spit in a tube, literally. It gets shipped to our lab, and the lab will then extract the DNA from the saliva and sequence it. So sequencing it literally means measuring and reading and scanning that DNA. That's the part where everybody can do that. In fact, you can go buy a testing machine and put it in your basement and start tomorrow. It's not a big deal. The challenge is the interpretation. What does it all mean? If I give you a stack of paper with a bunch of data is dumb. You have to know what it's trying to tell you. And so what we did, and we found the same thing, that the standard sort of industry standard interpretation wasn't enough. And that's why you got to that 80% good luck type scenario. Mm-hmm. And so we set up a clinic here in Toronto, and we spent 3 years studying 7,000 people. And this is what got us from that probability-based genetic insight to much more certainty, because we understood the habits of these people, their traits, their environment, their nutrition, who was doing well, who was not doing so well. And now we can teach all of what we learned back to people through the reports.
Right. So you're taking what their genetics is saying, and I don't know how much we want to get into this, but what are we looking at with the genetics? Are we looking at mutations or variations? Like how what's the way to explain that concept to people?
Yeah, there's 3 things we look at. One is called a SNP, which means that if a gene is thousands of letters long, which they are, and you have 22,000 genes that make up your genome, there may be a spelling mistake in the gene. It was supposed to be a T in this location, and instead it's a C. So now all of a sudden that gene doesn't function. Either it functions too well or not so well. And both could be a problem depending on what that gene's supposed to do. First of all, what is a gene? A gene is an instruction that tells your cells what to do. Every single one of our 50 trillion cells has this instruction manual inside of it. The different types of cells know what page to read to do their jobs, right? So a heart cell becomes a heart cell because it reads the heart section of the manual, and that's the job that it then does. So it's literally an instruction manual. So the first type of error you might have in that manual is a spelling mistake, a snip. There's also something called an insertion or deletion, which means there may be a paragraph missing from a gene or an extra paragraph. So imagine you're reading a page and the paragraph is repeated. You literally got the instruction twice, right? There's also something called a copy number variation, which most genetic testing companies don't test for because it's a whole other thing you have to run.
Mm.
And so there's a cost consideration. What that means is I have a gene and I'm looking for a variation, or do I even have the gene? What if I literally didn't get the gene? Forget about a spelling mistake, a paragraph missing. The entire page is torn out of my human instruction manual. Or I have it repeated. That page is in there twice. And there's some very important parts of the human genome where this is possible, including your detox pathways, antioxidative pathways. So the areas that maintain cellular health, and this is why it's so impactful. So that's potentially what could be happening in your genome. Now, after sequencing it all goes into an algorithm to reinterpret for the problems that we actually need to deal with: anxiety, depression, burnout, keto diet, vegan diet, cholesterolemia, diabetes. So by understanding what broken code we have or what superior code we have, which can also be a problem, what does that point me to? Right. And now I know where I need to focus.
So is it correct to say that with those three different types of errors, or we'll call them variations, perhaps, it can either, the instructions can either be more efficient than, say, the average, it can be average, or it can be less efficient or suboptimal?
Yeah, and let me give you an example of how that might impact in one gene that all three are possible. So there's a gene called GSTM1, which is part of the glutathione pathway. Glutathione is a very important, glutathionization, that process is how we eliminate toxins from our body. So everyone knows you drink alcohol, eventually the liver gets rid of it for you somehow. But how does that happen? Well, glutathione is out there finding and binding these things and getting rid of them. So GSTM1 instructs glutathione in the gut, meaning that when you're eating local sort of North American foods as they are today, you know that's a bit of a threat. The pesticides, the chemicals, the food colorings, everything that's coming along with that food that was never meant to be in your bloodstream. So most of us, well, sorry, I shouldn't say most, 49% of us, according to our research, are completely missing the GSTM1 gene, don't have it. Why? Because until recently, food wasn't a threat. Didn't need it, right? It's only the last couple generations where food is in its current state. About 46% of us have only one copy, meaning that copy number variation I talked about, mom or dad gave me a copy, but I didn't get it from both, so I'm at like 50% capacity. 5% of us actually have both copies. So how does this play out, to your point of good may not be good, bad may not be bad, right? So completely missing it, don't have it, that's bad. What that means is I don't have a first line of defense in my gut. Toxins enter my bloodstream through my gut digestive tract. They probably cause some irritability and dysbiosis to the gut lining, eventually leading to a leaky gut, which then leads to toxins that are directly going into my bloodstream. So it's bad news to have 0 copies if you're not very, very careful about what you're eating. 1 copy, which is minus 50%, you're kind of detoxing and you're kind of letting stuff in. So you're in that middle. You're not doing the best job, but you're also slightly protected, right? So we don't see too many problems here. 2 copies, you would think, is the best. You would think now I have that first line foot soldiers, standing at the gate protecting me. But what's actually happening is because food wasn't a threat, we did not need to protect our guts from toxins. And so if you have both copies and you're eating the wrong foods, it triggers an autoimmune response because you're doing this job so well, it's too much. Right? So now the interpretation isn't as simple as you have it or you don't. You have the variation, you don't have the variation. What kind of variation you have? We have to then sit in the clinic and sit with people and understand when they have 2 copies, but which we thought was good, which science actually says is good, it's actually not. It's too much. and it literally triggers autoimmunity. So that interpretation, that's the most important part of what we do, which is built right into the reports.
Right. And the current version of your interpretation portal is awesome, where it has all the videos, it have podcasts, episodes, audio recordings that people can listen to, and it's designed for their unique genetic variations and codes. So I thought I'd share with the audience here a few specific examples. I mean, you shared a great one there in terms of glutathione, but a few others that people might be dealing with right now or might be in their family. So I thought the first one we talk about is cardiovascular disease. There are certain changes in the DNA that can affect the progression or the risk that people have for cardiovascular disease. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the way we think about cardiovascular disease, we don't think of it as a disease of the heart. We think of it as the disease of the arteries. So if you think about it, really, calcification, cholesterolemia, blockages, the heart's doing fine up until the last second where it's not getting its blood and then you have a heart attack. Everything starts in the arteries. So what we look for, again, understanding true root cause. Why is there variability? 5 people with the exact same lifestyle, home, food, etc. One of them gets sick faster than the rest. We've understood that we can determine if this is your artery, the inner lining, it's called the endothelium. That's the actual membrane that the blood touches as it's flowing, right? There's different quality versions of that. So literally your hardware, you could have great stainless steel hardware, or you could have garbage, paper thin hardware. And there's some in between. So depending on what kind of hardware you have, you may be more prone to inflammation. So even then, you could have the worst hardware, bad quality, which we can determine genetically. Doesn't mean you're getting sick unless you put the wrong loads on it, which we know what those things are: stress, poor sleep, bad food, etc. So if you have, for example, what I said earlier, the lack of good glutathione function, which means you probably have toxins in your blood. And if you had this bad hardware, it's getting inflamed by those toxins, right? Because they weren't supposed to be in your blood. This cellular structure was not designed to deal with toxins because our ancestors didn't have that, right? So now all of a sudden you're getting inflammation. The body's response to inflammation here is to actually deploy cholesterol as a hormone to reduce the inflammation. That's cholesterol's job. It's actually protective. It's like a Vaseline that smooths things out. The challenge is when that Vaseline, the cholesterol, meets toxicity, it actually oxidizes it, it hardens, and it gets deposited. And then you get the beginnings of that buildup. And then one day you go to the doctor and they say, hey, your cholesterol numbers are up. You need to take a pill. All right, let's get that number down because that's the warning sign for a heart attack. But the real disease isn't cholesterolemia, it's endothelial inflammation. So give me a 5-year-old child and I can tell you this. You don't need to wait until you're 55, 60, 65. We can predict this today so that whatever's coming in the future, you can prevent. Right? Do you now understand what habits I need to have? Why would I get inflammation? Is it oxidation? Is it glutathionization? Is it poor methylation? These are the various functions that you're supposed to be doing well, and maybe you're not doing well. Now you know exactly where to focus to prevent this from happening.
Yeah, and cardiovascular disease is one of those things where it's like once you see the signs of it, it's almost already too late. And at that point,
Right.
you're trying to mitigate the ill effects. And I've been listening to Dr. Peter Tia had a great episode recently on his podcast where he talks about fatty streaks being visible in the bodies of teenagers. So if someone dies of an accident or they die at war, they do an autopsy, they see signs of cardiovascular disease that early.
Right.
The problem is with medicine the way it's been is that they will start checking or screening for cardiovascular disease once you hit maybe 40, if you're lucky.
Yeah.
Sometimes older than that, because a lot of us don't go to the doctor until we hit maybe our 50s, because we start worrying about these things because people around us start having events. But by then, the disease progression has happened for 20 or 30 years. So that's what I like about a test like this is that we can see warning signs or see potential issues really early on before you have those signs, and then go have the testing done to see, all right, what does cholesterol look like? Or for myself, my action step was, well, my genetic testing showed that my Teflon coating on the inside of those arteries is not too good.
Right.
And I don't deal with oxidation very well. So actually a couple action steps for that. One was I went and got a calcium artery score done, and I actually had a score that was, this should be 0 at my age. Of it was 41 at the time. It wasn't 0. So it shows me there's already some calcification, some damage there.
Right.
So it helped me identify that. And it helped me kind of gravitate away from metabolic conditioning type exercises, high oxidative loads, longer type of running, which was fine with me because I don't like endurance stuff. But it made me adapt the way I was exercising and focusing on different nutrients. So like resveratrol, turmeric is a staple in my supplement plan now, eating things like blueberries and colorful like bell peppers, red bell pepper, yellow peppers, to try to help do what I can to help lower that risk.
Yep. And in your case, it's like a counterintuitive, oh, my cardiovascular exercise is going to cause cardiovascular disease. How does that make any sense? And that's where this precision of how does my body work, not as how does a body work, how does my body work? It's true. And there's some people listening already know that when they go run on a treadmill, they don't feel right the next day. They're drained, they can't recover. So they probably, like yourself, also don't deal with oxidative stress well. The oxidation that's caused by over-oxidating yourself, by taking in too much, by getting into that heavy cardio output. And that's the person for whom you know the combo of bad hardware and here's the threat that's going to cause the inflammation. And you said it yourself, as healthy as you are, you already were down that path because your choices were misaligned to what you were designed for.
Yeah, I was wondering why. The biggest thing I noticed was going start CrossFit and then like working out, and then people go to the next day and work out the next day. I was like, how is that possible? Because I can't move. I'm sore. I feel beaten down, and I just wasn't recovering quickly. And I thought there was something wrong with me. It was just maybe a little bit wrong with me. It was just that it wasn't the right type of exercise for my body. So I moved over into the weightlifting, powerlifting world, and that's worked a lot better for me. So
me too.
Let's talk about another thing, hormone health. We have a lot of patients that deal with everything from, we'll talk about sex hormones in this respect. So whether it's low testosterone or we kind of see this thing where males might be producing enough testosterone, but they turned it into the wrong hormone after that, or females, they're either having issues with their hormones naturally or they get put on birth control and it causes some side effects. So let's talk about that a little bit, hormone health and our genetics.
Well, this is one thing that we uniquely do, and it can only be done if you think about hormones in their full cascade. So the challenge with genetics is this gene means this, this gene means this, this gene means this. The body doesn't work like that. The body has systems. And if you think about hormones, it's progesterone converts to testosterone, converts to estrogen. Whether you're a man or a woman, you do the same thing. Men do it every day, women do it monthly. Right? So we have our menstrual cycle that we don't really know much about. So in that cascade I just described, there's multiple variations of clearing it, making it. To what degree do I make it? Do I make the toxic version? Do I make the clean version? And this is why, combining this with something like cardiovascular disease, why is it that women fare so much poorer with cardiovascular disease? For example, 66% of women will die on their first cardiovascular event. No previous warning signs, no symptom. They didn't know they were sick. For men, it's a tiny fraction because of the hormone cascade. So you have one problem plus another problem, meaning some women just make a lot more estrogen. We can predict this genetically. It's very, very clear what versions of the genes you have doing the job of converting something into something else. You may have the fast version, which takes all your testosterone, drops it into estrogen. Then you have to make a metabolite. When women have their monthly cycle, it's not estrogen, it's an estrogen metabolite that's being cleared. And you have three options, one of which is great. The other two are very toxic. So if you're making these two toxins, you're dealing with another monthly serve up of this toxic insult causing inflammation. If you also have poor detox pathways, and this combination we see quite frequently and quite often. Now put this into a man and you say, like, somebody that's getting to a certain age is like, well, I want to take some testosterone and forget about a certain age. I'm in Toronto and we deal with a lot of NHL hockey players because this is where they do all their training. And in 2019, there was this sort of trend of taking what's called an androgen gel pack, meaning you put this pack on your stomach, androgen or testosterone gets absorbed into your skin. And the thinking is, I have more testosterone. What was happening? Men were growing man boobs, gynecomastia. Why? Because that cascade. If I give you testosterone, I need to know what your body does with it. Does it keep it in a pool of testosterone? Does it convert it into DHT, which gives you the nice ripped lines and a six-pack, but also causes problems to your prostate and causes hair loss? Or does it convert it into estrogen? We all do different things. Mm-hmm. And this is what happened. So some of these men did really well. Some of these men completely lost their libido, man boobs, but they had beautiful hair and skin, right? Because they were loading it all into the estrogen bucket. So even understanding where and when to intervene when it comes to hormone treatment, whether you're a man or a woman, I'm not saying don't do it. Do it. It's a great thing to do to maintain that youthfulness and vitality and all that. But you need to know exactly with precision where to intervene. It may not be give me more testosterone. It may be that I make a lot of testosterone, but I clear it. So I just need to be able to use what I have. I don't need more, right? So you can be very precise about that. And then this is particularly impactful. The last thing I'll say with out of all the research we did with all those thousands of people in our research phase, the thing that kept standing out as the big problem that needs fixing is female hormone health. All of the major female, menopause, infertility, fibromyalgia, endometriosis, all that stuff was being treated as gray area where, well, it's your hormones. You're supposed to have problems, right? You're supposed to go on a roller coaster every month and have PMS, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be made very, very black and white if you understand your cascade and who you are hormonally. And this is why it's so gray, because we're very different, but we only have one answer for every problem, which may be working on 1 out of 10 people, right? So understanding your hormones makes everything, especially for women, much more precise. You know where to intervene, maybe you don't need to intervene, and all these sort of roller coaster problems that women go through don't need to happen.
Yeah, I'm glad you finished up with that, because my daughter is a great example of this. And as we were going over our reports with Dr. Mansour, we talked about how her cascade sends it into the not so good, that the E4 estrogen, where that could put her at a higher risk for breast cancer, I believe. And it's more problems like PCOS and fibroids and like all the bad stuff that comes along with PMS and excess estrogen. And so the recommendation for her is, the action steps are, we could focus on veggies that contain compounds that help her produce more of the good estrogens,
right?
Which thankfully she likes to eat, and she kind of gravitated towards on her own. And then also, if she ever gets to the point in her life where birth control is recommended, it's probably not going to be wise for her to take more estrogen on top of the estrogen that she's already overproducing and putting into the wrong pathways. So at age 8, the hardest part, actually she was age 6. The hardest part was getting her to spit into the tube. She didn't quite understand why she was doing that. But now that information, her genes, these variations don't change, right? So now she has that information to equip her for the rest of her life.
Yeah, it's that personal playbook. It's not trial and error, one size fits all. Let me go listen to a podcast to try and figure out what to do. It's your human instruction manual. And what a blessing to give that to your daughter. It's not just hormone health, it's everything about her brain and what career should she be leaning towards, what sport should she be playing. When you have it that young, how is the body going to develop? Should she be deadlifting 400 pounds and aiming for that, or should she be sprinting, right? It's very clear what the body's going to look like based on the hormones. Everything about anxiety and how many issues young women go through these days. And my own niece had an anxiety attack where she crashed and burned, fell over, and I actually had to take her to the hospital because we thought she broke her leg because she fell pretty hard. And the answer was, well, if it happens again, let us know. And I know what that meant is, if it happens again, she's getting prescribed a pill for anxiety. And silly me, I hadn't looked at her genes, which I had already done. So I did. And her hormone cascade. So at the beginning of the cycle is when you have the least hormones. You just finished clearing everything, right? She doesn't make enough estrogen. So her delta value, that bottom, is much lower for her. On top of that, she doesn't metabolize vitamin D well. Vitamin D is responsible for 10% of your human biochemistry. Of the 22,000 genes that make up your body and your instructions, 10%, 2,000 of them require vitamin D to function. This was happening during peak COVID lockdown, where she was homeschooled for 4 months in Toronto winter and hadn't been outside. Right? So she hadn't been outside in 4 months because of the lockdown. Zero vitamin D. And at this point of that month is when she was at her lowest possible hormones, and it led to this anxiety attack. So she didn't have an anxiety issue, which is what was being diagnosed. What she had was a hormone cascade that was a little unique, and a context where she wasn't getting a vitamin D or enough vitamin D for those few months. She just hadn't been outside, right? So the solution could have been a pill for a label of anxiety, or let's upregulate your vitamin D like crazy. Let's give you 10,000 IU. And guess what? The very next month, she didn't have a problem and hasn't had it since. Right? And she probably would have been on a pill still today if I didn't know this information.
And the thing there too is you could have put her on the anxiety pill, but it's not addressing all of the other potential side effects of being low in vitamin D and that abnormal or that suboptimal hormone cascade. So that's what I love about this stuff, this root cause stuff. That is, when you fix one problem, you fix 10 problems or potential problems or prevent problems downstream, versus playing whack-a-mole and hitting that symptom and this symptom and this symptom. And people end up on 12, 15 different medications by the time they're 70 years old. So you mentioned something more earlier when we talked about my daughter, and you touched upon it a little bit with your recent example there. But it's the idea of executive function or mental health, and how knowing these gene variations can help us kind of dial things in, or maybe choose career or job functions that are more congruent with what our genes are best at. So let's kind of finish up with that.
Sure. So this is one thing that I would say out of all the work we did. So the thing I think needed most work was female hormone health. The thing that I enjoyed the most was executive function, because in our research, like I said, we sat with people, we interviewed people, 7,000 people, by the way, which is the largest study of its kind in the world, and we were able to document their behaviors. And now with the genome in hand, we could say, well, here's what's going on with dopamine. Here's what's going on with serotonin. And over and over again, we see these people behave like this. They perform like this at work. They complain of these problems. And so we were able to create these avatars and profiles that with great certainty point to how you behave. So if I have your DNA, I don't need to talk to you to understand your personality to a T. You know, are you entrepreneurial? Do you procrastinate? Are you irritable? How it affects your sleep? Are you a drama queen that slams doors and yells and walks out of meetings? To a T, we can describe this stuff. And we know what the neurochemicals do. So simple example. So in my niece, to paint the story a little further, her ability to bind dopamine was suboptimal. So dopamine is the chemical that allows you to experience pleasure and reward. So I eat something tasty, pleasure. I do something good at work, that's reward, right? So there's a gene called DRD2 that determines how dense your receptors are, and hers was way down here, right? Then there's a gene called MAO, which breaks the dopamine down to get you ready to get rid of it. You have to come back to normal eventually. Then there's a gene called COMT that clears it. You've broken it down, now I got to get rid of it. It's that broom that comes along and sweeps it up, right? So she had the dopamine way down here, and she had a really fast MAO and a really fast COMT. So it was difficult for her to experience pleasure. So now you have a child who's already teetering on, I don't really get much out of this world, right? And now you've dropped my hormones and taken away my vitamin D. So that's why it triggered as an anxiety response, because she was already there at the borderline. She just needed that catalyst to push her over the edge, right? So now this same person, by the way, could experience depression or anxiety because things don't feel good. They could also experience addiction because they find the thing that gives them pleasure and they continue to go down that path and they do more and more and more and more and more. Or they could experience achievement because they go down the reward path. Dopamine powers both. Ultimately, it's satisfaction is what you're looking for from either pleasure or from reward. And if you go down the reward path, you become entrepreneurial and successful because you take big risks. You may also crash and burn because you take some stupid risks, right? But you'll see that prototypical entrepreneur who's crashed 3, 4, 5 times and then finally lands on something great and does something incredible and changes the world. This is the genetic profile that drives that type of behavior. Then you may layer on top of that a dysregulated serotonin response. Serotonin is commonly known as sort of your mood regulator, but what it really does is it allows your brain to prioritize stimulus, meaning smell, sound, noise, pleasure, annoyance, all the stuff that our brain is dealing with, the ability to focus and deal with what's relevant. A lot of people that you'll see that are sort of high functioning, that are entrepreneurial, that do big things, don't do well here. So they're chronically, constantly distracted and bothered by every stimulus, which means a couple things. It means to the people around them, they're very irritable. You know, they're very they get annoyed at everything. But internally, it's like they see every little detail, right? dot every I, cross every T. When they go to a meeting and somebody said 5 things, they remember word for word what the 5 things were and they hold them to it, right? So this plus that low dopamine profile leads to what we call a high functioning anxiety. Somebody that's driven to things because their gut has this fire in it where they just can't let go of every little detail. It all matters to them, right? And they're seeing way more details than the people around them see to begin with. Combine that with that reward seeking behavior, it's going down this path of like seeking reward at a very high level of detail. That can create great things. It can also create an anxiety response like you can't get out of bed in the morning, depending on your context. And this is why it's so important, especially for our children, especially for when we go to work, especially trying to deal with relationships, to understand how are you wired up here? How do you perceive the world? Right? What do you think is actually going on? And why that could potentially create some friction with the people around you or create this perfect marriage if you understand who you are and where you fit in that puzzle. If you think about whether it's a relationship or a team or parenting, we are different. So you need to understand your role. What are my superpowers and what's my kryptonite? It's that simple, right? What am I good at? I am the person that doesn't bind trauma and pain. Literally, genetically, I don't bind pain and trauma, so I can go ahead and deal with the problems, right? Or I do bind the trauma and pain, so I'll be the emotional EQ person that the family can lean on that will make the emotional decisions, right? So you can start to see where you fit. Being in the right contract text, you thrive. Being in the wrong context, it's a mental health issue. Right? So most of what we label with anxiety, depression, addiction, burnout, these are people that are wired with a superpower that are in the wrong context, which leads to a mental health issue. And this is not everything. I'm saying that 10 to 15% of mental health issues are innate. You have them. There's a chemical imbalance. You have something that requires medication treatment. 85 to 90% is what we're describing here, which is you were not born with a problem. You don't have a problem, but your context is not aligned to what you're wired for, and that leads to a problem. Right? And not only can you unpack it, you can also turn it into a superpower if you were in the right context. Right? So this is the work we do with sort of executives, CEOs, athletes, children. It's super, super impactful.
And that's what I love about this. I mean, everything we test for on this report is actionable. Like some things you can't really do much about. I mean, you got like the BRCA gene with breast cancer, and like you have that, your risk is super high. And other than having a mastectomy, perhaps, and maybe dialing in your other hormones based on the type of testing that you guys do, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Cystic fibrosis carrier, where you get the gene when you're born, not a whole lot you can do about that. But with this stuff, like in that last example there of executive function, we can do a few things, right? We can biochemical. There's pathways we didn't talk about, methylation, we didn't get into all that, but we can dial in methylation. We can make sure vitamin D is optimal. Like in the example of your niece, we can pick roles and jobs and tasks that more align with our unique genetic code so that you're not frustrated by working a task. It's almost like we see something like this profile, for example, or some of these other personality traits quizzes where are you in the right job for your personality type. And it's interesting because I'm sure those personality types line up with the genetic testing. There's probably a lot of similarities there. But yeah, that's what I love about this is you can actually do something with the results and make some changes to either put yourself in a better position now, or at least sometimes knowing, like they say, knowing's half the battle, right? Is just knowing. And that example, I'm going to play that 30 seconds there when you describe the irritability and stuff like that, because I think that's key. And I'll show my wife that later. But yeah, I just love this stuff. So for someone that's interested, they're watching this right now, and they're like, I need to get this done. Explain the process and how that all works. And we'll have a link that we'll share either in the links below here, or if I send this out in an email later on, I'll make sure those people have those links.
Sure.
To get set up for the test. But yeah, let's wrap up with that, and then we'll let people get started.
Well, first of all, it's amazing that people get to work with you, right? Because now all of a sudden you have this tool, but you also have a quarterback that can drive you through the journey, right? It's really powerful when you have that versus, not that the reports aren't useful, they're meant to be self-serve and go ahead and go through it, but there's knowledge that you have and experience you have that can really navigate this for people. So the process is simple. The kit whether with, some clinicians stock them in house, some having them shipped, so we'll figure that out. But it can be shipped to you. You're literally spitting in the saliva tube. It gets shipped back, and over a period of a few weeks, we sequence it and populate that algorithm. You'll get a notification to log in and review your portal. And in that portal, it's not a report per se. I would say it looks more like a Netflix where you're clicking into things and drilling in and looking at tiles and self-navigating. There's the podcast you talked about where our AI goes and pulls audio files that are relevant to you to give you a personal podcast. So on one end, you're looking up problems like hormones, cardiovascular, addiction, anxiety, and reading about those things. On the other end, you're having this AI tell you about your genes, the actual gene results. This gene does this. You have this version of this gene, which means you behave like this, right? So going through your personal review. And then there's some video to teach you how to think about that system differently. What are the systems? Cardiovascular, diet and nutrition, everything about, how to eat, when to eat, etc. Hormones, so fitness, body type, cellulite, hair, skin, and then reinterpreting that for the big hormone problems we talked about earlier. Sleep, I can't fall asleep, I can't stay asleep, I sleep through the night, but I wake up feeling like garbage. What's going on there? Those are genetically three very different things. Executive function, we said, everything about the brain and how you're wired, and then immunity, detox, and anti-inflammatory response. So how are you at the cellular level, which is where disease starts, right? So in those 6 systems, there's a video for each one of those to teach you how we think about it. Just like in the cardiovascular example, we don't think of cardiovascular disease as a heart disease. We think about it as an artery disease. So just the same, we teach you about all the rest of that. And then you will get, not you, the listener, but you, buddy, will get a clinician overview, which is really important because there's certain things that we aren't allowed to say directly to a consumer. It requires you in between, right? And so there's certain recommendations which are more comprehensive that we're just regulatory wise aren't allowed to hand over. And in the work that people are doing with you, you will have access to that clinician summary, which gives a lot more sort of in-depth recommendations and more clinical language around the problems themselves, which then allows you to work with people on their plans or optimizing whatever the challenges you're facing. It's this perfect marriage of they have the information, go ahead, dive deep, you have clinical insights, and now you can start working on programs to get better.
Yeah, awesome. And the reports were always awesome. But when we first did these 3 or 4 years ago, when they first came out, ton of information. It was hard for even me with hours of training with Dr. Mansour Mohammed, and it was really difficult to navigate. But your newest portal with those videos and the interpretations is fantastic. There's just so much information in there. That's what I like about this too, is that people watch all the different shows out there, they listen to podcasts, and you follow all of that advice, and you have 1,000,001 things that you could do to help enhance and improve your health. But with this, it helps you kind of target in on those specific areas where you need to make those changes. And going back to my example with the cardiovascular health, I shouldn't be doing a lot of endurance running because that could set me up for a major event later on down the road because it's doing damage to my arteries. So the small tweaks like that over decades can make a big difference and be the difference between a stroke or a heart attack and not having that and until much later on in life. And the cool part too about you would expect something like this, like we hear of genetic testing, especially at the old medical type testing, people have had it done in the past. It could be thousands and thousands of dollars. This is in the hundreds, like less than 500 at the time we're recording this. And you only have to do it once too. So it's not like a lot of the functional medicine testing. We do a stool test. I do a stool test for $500, and then you got to repeat it in 6 months to see how you're doing, or if to make tweaks, or you do it a couple of years later to see how you're doing. This is done once and done, and your genetics don't change, right?
Yeah, it's once, and you log into your portal 6 months from now, you're going to learn something that you didn't learn today. We keep updating the algorithm, making it better as we learn. We want you to learn, and that's what we believe genetics was meant to be. This never-ending interpretation of our human instruction manual. So we love the work we do. It's going to keep getting better.
Awesome. Yeah, if you haven't had this done yet, I know some of our members, some of our patients, some of my audience has just a handful so far as we're unveiling this now. But yeah, if you want something that's going to be actionable, it's going to help you set you up for the long term. I would highly recommend this. My whole family did it. We did a couple of years ago, and like you said, you're constantly updating. So I'm learning more information now than even I did a couple of years ago with those test results. So thank you, Kashif. This was awesome. This is very informative for me. I'm sure it's informative to the audience. Anything that you want to share before we log on off here?
No, it's a pleasure. First of all, just the fact that anyone's here listening, they're already on the right path. You know, a lot of people, it's like, why is it that 70% of your healthcare budget is spent in the last year of your life? That's the average American, right? Because we wait and we ignore and we feel like we're invincible. We feel like I can do whatever I want, and when I break something, it's the doctor's job to fix me, right? That's sort of the American reality, which is not the way. That's sick care. That's managing disease and illness. Healthcare is not getting sick, and it's possible. The challenge is the toolkits, or what's required in the toolkit, is not what sort of primary MD is armed with. They're armed with, I see a problem, I see a pain point, I will help you mask it, and when you don't complain anymore, check mark, success. Doesn't mean we even figured out why you got in the first place. So the technology, like you said, it's now sort of consumable. This was thousands of dollars just a few years ago, you know, and there wasn't interpretation. There wasn't an artificial intelligence platform for people to just dive in and read. It required some specialists, of which there was only a handful in the world that knew how to even interpret it. So that access it's that answer to, how do I make disease a choice, right? How do I decide at what pace I age? You know, how do I make sure that those last 10 years are not in a hospital bed, but playing with my grandchildren and jumping out of airplanes and riding bikes wherever I go? It's very possible. You know, if you look at certain, call it the blue zones, where people live a certain way, do certain things, that's how they live. So you just need to understand what those right habits are for you. And disease should be a choice. Aging should be a choice. Health, I should say energy optimization should be a choice. It's all very easy now. You just need to do the work.
Yep. And as they say, it'd be nice if we would have had this when I was in my teens or 20s. But the saying is, the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time is today. So
yeah,
it's never too late to start working on these things. So thanks again, everyone watching this. If you're ready to participate in this test and get your results, go ahead and click on the link. I'll post here somewhere, or reach out to me if you have any other questions, and we'll get you set up with a kit so that you can submit your results and get all that great information within a period of probably 3 or 4 weeks. So, all right. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.